I guess everybody had time to join. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this new edition of the E-Axis webinar. As you know, this webinar series is part of the E-Axis Forum on macroeconomics, finance, and climate change. And this forum is here to facilitate the exchange of ideas on this important subject and also to discuss policies and research on these issues. You have also a Slack page, which is also part of this forum, where you can post new articles, conference, or whatever, or exchange ideas with the people there. And so far, we've been looking at papers that were looking at either theoretical issues or focused on some countries or area. And today we're going to be a bit broader than that and look at the international dimension of climate change with a paper that look at the different international cooperation. And it's my pleasure for that to welcome Maria Sole Pagliari for a presentation. Maria Sole is a research economist at the Monetary and Financial Analysis Division at Banque de France. And prior to that, she was an economist at the European Central Bank. Her research interest includes monetary policy, international finance, macroeconomics, and economics of climate change. And she has received a PhD in economics from Rutgers University in 2020. Maria Sole, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward for your presentation. Before that, we have, as usual, some questions for you to, yeah, here they are. Please answer them, and that will help us start the debate. And let me, in the meantime, already announce in advance the next webinar, where Francesco Dridi from the European Central Bank will present the ECB climate plan of the central bank at the ECB. That's going to be on November 8th. So I guess everybody could answer now. Maybe we can. So what are the projected economic costs of climate change over the next 50 to 80 years without additional policy initiative? And in your opinion, what is the most efficient policy mix to promote a green transition? So let's see the results. So a majority for between -30 and -10% of GDP. And yeah, we have fiscal policy and trade policy as a majority, but fiscal policy and monetary policy are not far behind. And I guess you will give us quite a clear answer on that. And I'm looking forward to the presentation. Just before you start, for everyone, you can ask your question in the Q&A section. So please feel free to do it during the presentation, and then I will relay the question, or I can also call people to ask their question live. Maria Sole, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Pierre, for this very nice introduction. Let me thank you again for having me today at this webinar. It's very nice. And today I'm gonna
just before you start, maybe you might have a full screen. Put it on full screen. We see
yeah, no, I was about to do that. And as I said, I do step by step with this computer because you never know. Let me know if there are problems in displaying or you don't see me anymore in camera, and I will fix.
We see you and we hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So thanks again. Then let me just quick start here the presentation. So as Pierre was mentioning, in this paper, we really took an international perspective on the issues related to climate change, in particular containment of adverse consequences of climate change. So this is a paper co-authored with Massimo Ferrari, an economist at the ECB. So as usual, the usual disclaimer applies also in this case. Now, just to provide you with a quick introduction to the issue, I mean, climate change, it's really the issue that has been debated now for quite some time. It's there. We are all aware of dangers related to that, but yet the climate policy initiative, it's been a bit disappointing so far. And with the COVID crisis, the focus really has shifted to other problems that were more contingent, let's say, but now finally the attention has been again shifted towards the climate change related issues. But what about the climate action? So I came across this very nice cartoon from The Economist, and basically this really well captures where we stand now. So we know that the danger is real, it's there, it's kind of daunting, of course, but then the way countries are interacting with each other, it's, as I said, a bit disappointing. So each country is really waiting for, or each region, let's say in the case of the European Union, it's waiting to see whether the others are going to take initiative now. So everyone is really pointing at the international cooperation as a very important element here, but this element is so far a bit missing, at least on the, let's say, on the action side. But yeah, as I said, the danger is real. So to reply to the first poll question, this is a chart that's coming from the WEO of the IMF released in October 2020. And as you can see here, I'm focusing more on the blue line and the most recent estimates of possible damages over the next decades have really worsened over time. So here, the red line, those are estimates coming from the early 2000s, or let's say more the mid 2000s. And here I'm showing you this blue line. These are estimates that have been updated in 2015. And projected losses in terms of GDP are estimated now to be between 15% to 30% by of global GDP by 2100. So this is not, we're not talking about peanuts. It's really something substantial. Not talking about the very long consequences that are not really immediately captured by measures like the GDP, but they are going to take a toll onto the economy as well. And then what about, as I said, the political initiative? Well, we all know by now the Paris Agreement. So according to the Paris Agreement, in order to avoid these the most adverse climate scenarios, the growth in new emissions should be maintained below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels. Actually, this target has been even updated more recently. So now we talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this is translated into a very sharp decrease in emissions. So if we want to meet this target, emissions should be at least 50% lower over the next 30 years. So it's pretty challenging as an objective, but I want to see, you know, the bright side of the issue. So I really think that if countries really start now, they could still have a chance to hit the target. Even though, I mean, if you look at this picture, and this is provided by the Climate Action Tracker, the situation is less rosy than what I hoped for. So if you look a bit at where we are now, so with current policies, and this is the shaded, the blue shaded area here, we would be very, very far away from the targets. While actually, in order to meet the Paris Agreement target, you should really, emissions should really follow the trajectory outlined by the green area. And this is actually, this scenario here, it's what we are focusing on this paper. So the main question is what countries should do, what is the best policy mix for countries to implement in order to really set the economy on this trajectory. So this is the real research question here. And then as a second step, does international cooperation matter? So can countries really be considered as islands that go on with their own climate objectives, and then like an invisible hand for climate change, you simply have that the single initiative is going to bring about the global target or not. So this is the additional question that we try to address in the paper. So what are the contributions of this paper? So first of all, there is a very quick initial part, which is an empirical one, where we really want to investigate the relationship between emissions and economic performance. So it's been stated that there are threshold effects. So if you overcome a certain level of income, then additional emissions are more detrimental than beneficial to the economy, so on and so forth. So we started by really investigating the empirical regularities in the relationship between economic performance and emissions. Then in the second part of the paper, we move on to the bulk of the study. So we constructed this structural two-country model where we have two types of firms. We have brown firms and green firms. They both contribute to the output of each economy, but then brown firms are the only responsible for pollution and so for emission externalities. And most importantly, and differently from other papers, we estimate the model. So we take into consideration the data from the US and the Euro area, and we estimate most of the parameters using real data. And finally, we consider the optimal policy problem. So as I said, what are the best policies to achieve this objective of reducing emissions by 50%? We consider different types of policies, as you might have guessed from the poll question. The three main considered are fiscal policy, monetary, and trade policy in the form of import tariffs. And then we consider the implementation of these policies as well as their outcome in cooperative and non-cooperative scenarios. So scenarios where countries go on with their own policies without taking into account what the other country is doing, and scenarios where, on the other hand, they really cooperate, and so they set a common target to achieve, and they go on with their own policies, taking into consideration what the other country is doing. So before going into details, I will just provide you with the quick main takeaways in case I don't have time later on to wrap up. So first of all, we find empirical evidence of important threshold effects of emissions on output. So it means that if your past emissions are above a certain level, additional emissions are going to be more detrimental to the economy. So they're going to decrease output. Then in the model with the environmental externalities, so our theoretical two-country, two-sector model, we estimate, as I said, we estimate the model. We find that the emission costs as produced by our model are much closer to the empirical estimates produced by the literature. So in this, we provide an important contribution to the literature. Then this is very, very interesting. We also find evidence of some spillovers in terms of emissions from the US to the Euro area, starting from late 2016, in particular beginning of 2017. And this has been due mainly to a shift in the composition of the US government spending. So this was driven mainly by a change in the US government spending. And finally, talking about optimal policies in the baseline model, so without any intervention, monetary policy focuses on inflation targeting only. So it doesn't take into consideration the second objective of closing the output gap. And finally, and this is the last part of the paper, and the most interesting one, when we consider the policy experiments, so when we make a comparison across the different types of policies here, first of all, what we find is that monetary policy is completely ineffective in tackling emissions reduction. So monetary policy per se cannot achieve the climate objective. On the other hand, we find that fiscal policy can reach the climate objective, and actually it is the most efficient one in achieving the objective. But it's also true that fiscal policy, if pursued in isolation, so without the support of either monetary policy or trade policy, entails some welfare losses, so it's not incentive compatible, as we say. These policies, so fiscal policies aimed at containing emissions, are incentive compatible, so they can be implemented by countries if they are pursued in cooperation. And then I will explain to you later how do we model cooperation in our framework. In such a scenario, so when you have fiscal policies implemented by the two economies in cooperation, monetary policy has to act to reduce the social cost of fiscal interventions. As I said before, fiscal policy entails substantial welfare losses. So monetary policy has to intervene so that these losses are offset. And finally, tariffs are completely inefficient in reaching the objective. So this provides the answer to the second poll question. Actually, 40% of the people were right. The best policy mix is exactly a combination of a fiscal policy and monetary policy. So let's delve a bit deeper into the paper. I will be relatively quicker in this part, so about the empirical evidence, so to have more time to focus on the theoretical part. So long story short, here we take into consideration a structural model where you have 6 different endogenous variables for the two economies, the US and Euro area. So we have emissions growth, output growth inflation, 2 measures of returns to capital for the brown and green sectors, and a measure of monetary policy stance, which is the shadow rate in this case. And we set up a regime switching recursive VAR, which basically determines a shift across 2 regimes. So the coefficients of the VAR are allowed to change depending on past emissions. So if past emissions have overcome in the last 2 quarters a certain threshold level, which we call Z star here, then we enter into regime 2, which is a high level of emission regime. Otherwise, we are in regime 1, which we deem to be a low emission regime, let's say. And we take into consideration what are the contemporaneous coefficients. So what happens if today I increase my emissions by 1 unit? So we focus on these 5 coefficients here. So the effect on output, inflation, the 2 returns to capital, and the interest rates. But for the sake of in the interest of time, I will just show to you that, first of all, basically, the higher is the growth of emissions in the past, the more negative is the effect of additional emissions today onto the economy, and this is captured by the 2 coefficients here for the euro area. You see that the coefficient turns from positive to negative, and for the United States, it turns from positive to not significant. So it means that after a certain amount of emissions has been hit by the economy, additional increase in these emissions is going to be at best not significant for the economy, at worst, like in the case of the euro area, detrimental for the economy. And another thing that I want to point out here before moving on to the theoretical part, it's that if you look at the results for inflation, so the effect of emission changes onto inflation over the same period, you see that they are not that strong, or they are completely insignificant. And this is something that we are gonna encounter again when discussing the results of the theoretical model. So basically, emissions really work through the supply side rather than the demand side of the economy. And then finally, the structural model. So in this model, we model emissions as producing an externality which takes the form of an aggregate loss in production. So we follow the literature in this. So starting from a standard Cobb-Douglas aggregate production function like this one, basically we postulate that there exists a function script L, which is a function of the externality X, which is the total stock of emissions in the economy, which basically decreases output. So for each unit of capital, labor, and technology that they use in the production function, a certain fraction is lost. And this is the environmental externality as we model it in our framework. The environmental block then is completed with 2 law motions. One is for new emissions, which of course the new emissions depend on production itself. And the other one is for the stock of emissions, which is an AR1 process, which is pretty persistent over time and depends also on new emissions. So basically, we calibrated this rho so that the half life of the stock of emissions, it's around 90 years. So it's pretty persistent over time. And this is the environmental block. How do we include these into our model? As I said, we have two economies and two sectors. So you have a brown sector, which is denoted by B here, and a green sector, G. And then you have the counterparts, brown and green sectors in the foreign economy, which is here denoted with a star. So in each economy, you have the brown sector and the green sector. They are subjected to the environmental externalities, even though these environmental externalities are produced only by the brown production. So this XT here depends ultimately only on brown production. As you can see here from the low motion of the new emissions, they really depend only on the brown production in both countries. And then on top of that, you have that the new emissions produced by both economies feed back into the total stock of emissions. So in each economy, you have that the aggregate loss in GDP is also driven by the emissions decisions made by the other economy. So you have within country externality due to the fact that the brown firms are the only one to pollute, while green firms are subjected to the externality without polluting. And then you have a cross-country externality because each country contributes to the total stock of the externality. Here, I'm going to be very quick. We make an assumption about the functional form of the loss function for the externalities. What is really important here is that in our framework, there is this perverse feedback loop between output and emission. So if you increase brown production, you have that also the stock of externality is going to increase, which is going to increase the cost of these externalities, so the loss associated to the externality, which is gonna dampen again production. So for each shock that increases production, a fraction of this shock is completely dampened and offset by the externality. And of course, since XT, so our stock of emissions is pretty persistent over time, and this affects the optimal policy in this steady state. And this relates also as to the efficiency and efficacy of the different policies, because if a policy is able to change the steady state, is also able to tackle the externality, while if a policy cannot change the steady state, that's not possible. And so very quickly, this is how our model fares compared to the literature. Here I'm showing to you the estimated GDP losses for US and Euro area, the black bars here as estimated in our model. And the other gray bars are estimates coming from earlier studies. So in terms of the US, I mean, most of these studies are focusing on the US. You can see that they are not that distant. In case of the Euro area, really here you have less measure of comparison because some of these studies do not include the Euro area. But let's say that compared to studies like Nordhaus 2017 or even TOL 2002, we find that our estimates are much more reasonable, let's say, more aligned to also the findings of, for instance, the IMF. And finally, and this is the most important part, optimal containment policy. So we are entering here the last part of the presentation, the last part of the paper. We start with monetary policy. So the idea here is to understand whether monetary policy can somehow play a role in achieving the climate objective of reducing the emissions by 50%. The short answer is no. So if you take into consideration the optimal monetary policy, this is the table, these are the coefficients. Basically, tau pi is the coefficient on inflation and tau y is the coefficient on the output gap, because we postulated that the monetary authority follows a Taylor rule type of policy function. You can see that in a scenario where you have a climate externality, for instance, so the model that I showed, the framework that I just explained to you, and the Euro area and the US, they pursue their own monetary policies without caring about the rest of the world. You can see that in this case, monetary policy would just care about inflation targeting, so it wouldn't put any weight on the output gap. But of course, I mean, emissions would even increase, so you wouldn't have any reduction in emissions. You would have perverse effect on welfare here. So, I mean, this is not really the best outcome, let's say, even if taken into cooperation. So even if the two economies were really aiming at maximizing the global welfare through monetary policy action, you would see that the outcome in terms of emission reduction would be really, really disappointing. Actually, emissions would even increase. So monetary policy just focuses on inflation targeting. The optimal monetary policy cannot achieve the climate objective. But then the next question that we ask in the paper is whether, I mean, this is kind of normal by construction, because the rule of the Taylor rule really doesn't care about anything else but inflation and output gap. But the question is, what if we postulated a different type of policy, so a different type of policy rule? So we repeated the same exercise. I'm not going to show you the results here in the interest of time, but they are available. Basically, we repeat the same exercise by changing the loss function of the central bank, so that the central bank now targets also the climate objective. But actually, the results are not that similar from this table here. So again, the monetary policy itself is not sufficient to reduce emissions by 50%. And then the next step is to consider fiscal policy. So next tool is fiscal policy. And in the paper, we postulate that fiscal policy takes the form of a carbon tax. So basically, each country taxes brown production. So the total tax imposed to each brown firm K is proportional to the amount of emissions produced by brown firm K. And then brown firm K is also given the possibility to invest in an abatement technology. So basically, they can decide to abate a share of their emissions, mu, and optimally, this mu, of course, depends on taxation. So if tax is not strictly positive, so you have you don't impose any tax, mu is going to be equal to 0. So brown firms are not going to internalize the cost of increasing their emissions, and so they're not going to have an incentive to invest into the abatement technology. So in presence of tax, on the other hand, mu is strictly positive, and basically you can consider mu as the share of brown production, and it's going to be green. So somehow the brown firms are transforming their production so that they become green. And then we consider two cases where tax revenues are either redistributed to households or they're used to subsidize the green production. And in the first scenario, basically we assume that the state, so the government, really wants just to maximize households' welfare, while in another case we instead consider a government that wants primarily to reduce the emissions. So you have two cases where, on the one hand, you have a welfare maximizing government, and so it's going to take different decisions on taxation. And then on the other hand, you have a government whose primary objective is really the climate objective. And then on the side of the cross-country, so this is the domestic side. Again, each policy has two sides. So you have the domestic side, and then in terms of the cross-country side, you can decide. I mean, we have different experiments. So first, we postulated that the countries do not cooperate, and so they go on with their own policies. In a second scenario, which is the one that I'm showing you on these slides, you have strategic interaction. So each country plays a game, a contemporaneous game, where the tax rate, it's decided so to maximize the expected value of welfare, given the constraints, of course, of the model, but also what the other country does. So basically, here we solve a Nash game where the equilibrium is given by the intersection of dominant strategies. So basically, a dominant strategy for a country, it's the strategy that that country would play no matter what the other country does. And if you really take into consideration all the best strategies for each country, for each possible choice of the other economy, and you take the intersection of the two, which are the optimal response functions, then you get the Nash equilibrium. So the Nash equilibrium is really the intersection of the vector of optimal responses of each economy. So for instance, if you have the euro area would have a preferred tax rate if the US is not taxing, if the US is imposing a tax of 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So you construct these two functions and you get the Nash equilibrium or equilibria as the intersection of the two. And then we define another type of equilibrium, which is the equilibrium in cooperation or cooperative equilibrium, where the two taxes are chosen jointly, but without strategic interaction. So basically, the two countries agree to just maximize the global welfare, where by global welfare, it's really a weighted average of the two welfare of the US and Euro area. And so these are the results for optimal fiscal policy, where the countries do not strategically interact and they want just to maximize their own welfare. So they don't care about reaching the climate objective that much. They just impose the taxation so to maximize their welfare. And as you can see, I mean, when countries, the first two columns for each side capture the outcome when the two countries go in isolation. So they pursue their own taxation policies without taking into consideration what the other country does. So if you look a bit at the dynamics here, it's true that, for instance, if the euro area taxes, the global emissions would be reduced by 7%, domestic emissions by 17%, so very far from the 50% objective. And this is regardless of whether you have transfers to households or transfers to green firms. Actually, the effect on welfare would be a bit perverse. So if you look here at the change in welfare, it would have, of course, a negative welfare change for euro area, so a loss in welfare for the euro area, and even a gain for the US, because you would have, in particular, if you transfer the revenues to households, you would have some shifting of consumption, of brand consumption from the euro area to the US. The US is more polluting according to the model, so this would have some weird effects on emissions and welfare. And you can see that this policy is not incentive compatible, even in the case where countries would cooperate. And these are the two last columns, this one and the last one. Because it would have a decrease in emissions that would be very far away from 50%. It would be 17% and 19% for the two countries, and then you would even have a decrease in welfare. So countries would never go for this, would never have the incentive to tax and to go for this policy. And this is the case where they just tackle the welfare maximization problem. Then what happens when countries, in this case, in the global game. So here, just for aesthetics purposes, I'm just showing to you the payoff matrix in a very colorful way. So basically, the Nash equilibrium here, it's the equilibrium where it's the outcome of the strategic interactions of the global game. And basically, in this Nash equilibrium, the euro area would impose a tax of 0.15 here, while the US would not tax at all. So they wouldn't have the incentive, given the initiative of the euro area, to tax at all. So the euro area would be the only one to tax. And this is the outcome, actually. As you can see, the euro area would be the only one to tax. The US would just stay there and look. And of course, this is not sufficient. So emissions would even increase in the euro area for some perverse effects that I told you, because there's going to be some shifting in production across the two economies. Welfare in the euro area might increase, but in the US will decrease. So, I mean, again, you don't have an ideal outcome here. It's not, again, incentive compatible. And then when you switch away from strategic interactions and you look at the last column, so in the cooperative setting, where the two countries really sit down and say, okay, you know what, we're gonna just impose taxation, the two of us, so that the global welfare is gonna be maximized. So as you can see, in this case, the tax rates would be higher. But again, and the climate objective would be achieved because global emissions would decrease by 50%. But again, welfare, both in the US and the euro area, would decrease. So again, the two countries would never have the incentive to do that, just because there would be welfare losses, which would be even more pronounced for the euro area, because in the case of the euro area, basically the economy is, let's say, greener already compared to the US. So an additional reduction in emission is more harmful, is more detrimental compared to the US. And the same goes also for the case where you would transfer the tax revenues to green firms. So what is the takeaway here is that fiscal policy, no matter what's the configuration here, even in cooperation, fiscal policy is not incentive compatible. So the countries would never have an incentive to achieve the climate objective per se if there would be welfare losses. So as I said, what about considering different types of setups where you don't have just one policy lever? So in this case, I'm showing to you the outcome for the case where you would have a taxation on emissions accompanied by some monetary easing. So in this case, the monetary authority would not just stay idle, but it would intervene. It would change actually its function to accommodate the green transition. So basically what happens is that when you implement the tax rate, the new taxation, this would shift the steady state, as I explained before. And this, of course, would also create price instability. In particular, you would have some effects on both the green price as well as the brown price. And so in this case, there is room, there is purpose for the monetary authority to intervene to smoothen out the price instability and to change a bit its policy function. So to fine tune the policy function, so to accommodate the transition. And here, if you look at the cooperation cases, so again, two countries, they cooperate to implement taxation, and then there are the two central banks that intervene in the domestic economies to smoothen out a bit the implied volatility. You can see that in this case, let's focus, for instance, on column 4, where you have the transfer to households for tax revenues. You would achieve the objective. So in the last row, you see the change in global emissions. It would be exactly minus 50%. So the climate objective would be achieved. On top of that, if you look at the first 3 rows in the second block here, you would have an increase both domestically and globally of welfare. So in this case, we managed to find a configuration where climate objective is achieved and the policies are incentive compatible. So in this particular configuration, you would have the two countries would actually implement the policy, and it would also achieve the climate objective. But this is the only configuration. So the configuration where the tax revenues are directly given to households. In the case where, on the other hand, the tax revenues were to be given to green firms, you wouldn't have the same outcome. Actually, the policy would remain incentive incompatible, so it wouldn't be implemented. And finally, and this is the very last part. So basically, here we are all talking about changes in the steady state, so transition from one equilibrium to the other. But the presence of externalities as well as of these policies also changes the transmission of shocks. So here there is an example of domestic TFP shock by 1% in the euro area. And as you can see, while the increase in total output is exactly the same with and without taxation, the composition of this increase, it's pretty different. So brown output would increase even more with the tax, and then you would say, I mean, but this is a bit, I mean, you might think that this is a bit counterintuitive, but actually that's because brown firms in the dashed line scenario would green part of their activity. So they would boost their production by basically cleaning up a part of their activity. And this is captured by the dynamics of emissions. Emissions in the case of a tax would really go down compared to the case without tax. And the abatement, of course, would increase. So even the transmission of shocks, it's deeply affected by these policies, as well as volatility. So basically, if you look at volatility in US inflation, that would increase, the euro area inflation would increase, and that's why we make the case for the monetary authority to intervene here, because there would be room to smooth out the price volatility. And finally, and this is another implication of the model, we are also able to retrieve the transition paths for the emission stock. So in the model, like also in some scientific studies that we had the chance to review, what really matters is the stock of emissions, and that's it's the source of damages. So what happens to the stock of emissions under the different settings? So here, in the interest of time, I'm going to just talk about the cooperation type of setting. So what I've just shown to you, a case where you have a cooperation between the two countries. The two countries impose a taxation on brown production, and on top of that, the monetary authority intervenes to support the green transition. As you can see, this would be a scenario where the stock of emissions would decrease by 17% over 50 years, which is quite remarkable, given also the reduction in the new emissions by 50%. And finally, last but not least, we also talk about import tariffs. I promised these in the very beginning, and then I left these at the very last. So why are import tariffs so ineffective? So basically, these are the results of the policy exercise if we impose that the two countries will put a tariff on the brown imports. So the idea here is that, I mean, each country might want to shift the cost of taxation, let's say, onto the brown sector of the counterpart, so the brown sector of the other country. You can do so by imposing tariffs on brown imports in the form of l'indem pescatori. And basically, if you look a bit at the results and you look a bit at the welfare change as well as the emission changes, first of all, I mean, emissions, well, they are somewhat reduced, but not that efficiently. I mean, in the case of the euro area imposing this tariff, the US emissions would even increase. And then you would see that welfare would decrease a lot, in particular in the US. And why is that the case? Because in our model, we have a flexible exchange rates. So whenever you have these types of price distortion in trade, dynamics of the exchange rate, so appreciation or depreciation of the exchange rate, will basically offset the effect of these tariffs. And basically, you would have, again, like I was mentioning before, a shift in the consumption from the foreign brown sector, in this case, to the domestic brown sector. So consumers would just simply keep on consuming brown products, but produced domestically, and this will increase domestic emissions, and this will have, of course, a pervasive and as well as perverse effects on the economy. So to conclude, and I hope I'm on time. As I was mentioning at the very beginning, if you just look at the correlation, I mean, from an empirical perspective, if you look at the mere correlation between emissions and micro variables, you have that the past history is super important. So past emission paths really determine these types of correlation. And so existing estimates are likely to underestimate the impact of climate change on output. And that's why I was mentioning this revision in estimates that has happened over time. In our general equilibrium, we can analyze policies in a cross-country framework. We model the spillovers as well as policy interactions. And in terms of policy outcome, as I was saying before, monetary policy and tariffs are completely ineffective in reaching the climate objective. Fiscal policy is the most effective one in reaching the objective, but it's not incentive compatible. So if pursued in isolation, countries won't ever have the incentive to give up on their welfare just to hit the climate objective. These policies become incentive compatible from a cross-country perspective only when monetary policy acts to reduce the losses stemming from the green transition, and if there is, I mean, I should have added this on the slide, if of course there is cooperation across countries. So yes, interterritorial cooperation matters a lot, but again, it all depends also on the policy mix that countries go for. And that was all on my side. I hope that I was sticking to the schedule.
Very much in time. Thank you very much, Maria Sole. So let me remind you that if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box here. I have maybe one first clarifying question on my side for you. As far as I understood, so basically the central banks can only play with the interest rate in your model. That's the variable they change, and the interest rate is by changing the interest rate, they change the level of output. I'm not sure I understand how changing the interest rate has a different impact on the green sector and the brown sector, and basically how with changing the interest rate, a central bank can support the transition or not. Okay, can you maybe explain the channels through which this happened? Or is it?
Yeah, so basically here the problem is really given by this shift in production and the prices mechanisms that are triggered. So basically the idea is that the welfare losses are really I mean in our model they're also deriving from from this increase in the volatility of inflation. The volatility of prices and then consequently inflation itself. So in the case of the transfer to households, you have two effects at place there. You have an income effect. So basically what happens, you're making with the taxation, you are making the brown products more expensive, right? So you're somehow inducing, ceteris paribus, so at the same level of income, in order to pursue their consumption smoothing, households might decide to go for more green type of products. And this, of course, will take a toll. I mean, this will also increase the price of green products. On top of that, if you add the transfer, I mean, that's a bit more delicate, and that's why without monetary policy, the outcome is a bit perverse. It might be that the transfer it's enabled to offset these, and they might still want to go for the brown products, right? And then you have the substitution effect. But in one case, the income effect is really the one that matters the most, and somehow you want to stabilize this. I mean, you know that welfare it's also a second order type of thing. So if you have a volatility changes, sudden ones, the welfare is going to fluctuate a lot. So that's why monetary policy here kicks in. That's the main message. It's only through interest rates, it's true. But let me add here that we capture. Sorry.
Yeah, I understand how monetary policy can kind of compensate losses from fiscal law. But like if you would to take monetary policy alone, without fiscal nothing, and how a change in the interest rate in your model translate into a decrease in emission? Is it only because you reduce?
No, without policy, fiscal
you also
policy is not
induce the
possible.
transition.
No, but without fiscal policy, it's not possible. I mean, the monetary policy looks through the climate objective, and that's we state this really clear in the paper. Without fiscal policy, it's not, because the change in emission is a steady state shift. Monetary policy with interest rate cannot induce a steady state change, right? So it can just stabilize around a trend, a long-term trend, but per se, monetary policy cannot do that. So this is what we say in the paper. Per se, monetary policy can just stabilize another type of shift around the trend. Otherwise, it cannot. And that's why even when we do these experiments and we include, I didn't show this, but in the loss function, we have an experiment where we include average between welfare and emissions. So we also included the climate objective. It doesn't, I mean, it's not useful at all. And actually, this is in line with the literature. There is another paper by some Banca d'Italia colleagues that were also at the ECB. I don't know if you ever come across this, where they also show that green QE, so if you model monetary policy so that you have also unconventional through asset purchases, is not capable of delivering that much of an improvement in terms of the climate objective. But that's for the nature of monetary policy itself.
Just, yeah, I mean, you raise that was my next question actually, because here obviously in your model, monetary policy is not designed to change the mix of the economy.
Yeah.
It's designed to change the level. Now we have a lot of proposition now Also, there is a lot of proposition to green monetary policy, for example, and they rely more on unconventional monetary policy. So it's greening the assets. One solution, and here I'm echoing the question by Daniel Shilowski. I try to echo it. So what would happen, for example, if you could use a differentiated monetary policy for financing brown and green? So there are models. One of my colleagues, by the way, where monetary policy can set a higher rate for brown investment and lower rate for green investment. Here, Daniel is talking about capital requirement for brown credits. That's more, I guess, that's more macroprudential. But what if you could be a bit more targeted than what your model is?
Okay, there is always, I mean, this is kind of a complicated model per se, so you have to make your choice. I mean, you have to pick your battle. Here we pick the international cooperation battle because it's already pretty complicated, and we estimate the model. Let me stress this out, and it's already pretty complicated as it is. Of course, you could devise other types of policies where, for instance, the central bank would really implement the crediting easing policies or asset purchases with that particular objective. But as I mentioned, there is this paper, and actually it's becoming pretty well mentioned, where they show that QE, again, it's bringing about some gains, but not as much as as fiscal policy can do. So here again, yeah, everything is possible, but then from a policy perspective. So let's abstract for a second from the framework itself. You really have to understand who does what. So there is a role for fiscal policy, there is a role for monetary policy. So of course, monetary policy can change a bit the incentives in the economy, but I think that would be really the field of the role of fiscal policy primarily.
So I think the debate in central banking area with central banks now is not really. I think nobody contests that fiscal policy is the first tool to be used, and it is the one with most impact. I think a proponent of doing something with monetary policy is much more to support fiscal, to accompany, and to play on the margin. Now, I think with what is proposed in terms of differentiated interest rate or differentiated asset purchases, you can achieve a higher impact on emission than what you do in your model, which doesn't discriminate between that. That being said, it will not solve as it is shown in the paper that you mentioned, which was presented here, by the way. This will not solve the problem. First is fiscal, but we think in the real world, every policy should play its role and should push in the same direction. And one question that I have, do in your model also central bank have an incentive to cooperate together and also advocate for fiscal policy to cooperate and tax? I mean, do they, for a central bank, is it better if nobody cooperates and no tax is set, or they also have an interest in saying, okay, to the fiscal policy, let's cooperate and let's have tax, and so that they have an incentive to advocate for such policies at the fiscal level?
I think that welfare enters into the objective. I mean, in the loss function of the central bank. So of course, fiscal policy influences welfare, and it has, of course, it enters the loss function of the central bank. So I would say that in this model, as we devised it, no, because the central bank really just has this policy function, which is really that one. It's not really looking beyond inflation targeting and sometimes also output gap targeting. I mean, we've seen in most cases it's just inflation targeting, but just domestic one. That said, this is a pretty flexible model. I mean, this is just the first baseline setup, and I'm pretty much sure that there could be, in the way that it is now, no. I mean, the central bank just, it's a domestic authority, and it doesn't care about what happens elsewhere, or if the fiscal policy does or doesn't something, because as I said, in the baseline setting, emissions do not enter into the function of the central bank. That said, it enters, of course, indirectly, because you have this externality. So strictly speaking, no, but there is potential for the central bank actually to consider this. It would be, I mean, under a different rule. So it could be actually inserted more explicitly into the rule. But now on the top of my mind, as I said, we experimented a lot with these, and we couldn't find anything really stark that would say, okay, maybe we can make a strong case. So in the model as it is, no, we cannot really make a strong case for the central bank to say to the fiscal policy, okay, maybe it's better for you to intervene. But it might be, I mean, with some tweaks into the policy function, it might be. I can see that.
Maybe a last question by Marie Lemuel, who asking what would happen if you estimated the model with China and OECD.
That's actually
there's a more fundamental question of how robust are your results to empirical numbers.
Okay, so here the issue, I mean, the original idea was really to look at the advanced versus emerging markets. The two blocks would have been, I mean, still in my ideal world, I would like to do something like that. So advanced versus emerging markets. Problem is that, first of all, the data for emerging markets are not there. I mean, either they're not there or the time series is really short. So, I mean, you cannot really rely on the estimation results using this data. Secondly, I mean, as a wild guess, China is much more polluting of the euro area and the US. Now, if you look a bit at the dynamics of the models, taking as a comparison in euro area and euro and US, the higher it's the how's it called, the amount of emissions into the economy, the more pronounced are going to be some effects. For instance, the tariffs themselves that are going to be even more detrimental, for instance, or as I said, these shifting in consumption from one country to the other would have an even more pervasive effects. And sometimes these pervasive effects are against the US itself, so against the more polluting country. So I wouldn't exclude that some of these results would go against China, but of course, in other cases, China would benefit, in particular from tariffs. So beware of that. This is just a message. Beware of tariffs. Tariffs are never, they might look the solution, but they are not. And in terms of fiscal policies, again, I think that the international cooperation message would even more enforced because of this. So I think that these results would be even more pronounced, at least qualitatively. Quantitatively, I cannot know because I don't know the data, but qualitatively, I think that would be even more pronounced because of this particular composition of the two economies, or in this case, the China economy. We can presume that it's slightly more polluting than the US. Or maybe it's as polluting as the US and more polluting than the euro area. So making the comparison between the US and euro area, no, in this case, I can tell you these things.
Thank you very much. Maybe if you couldn't stop sharing your screen. Because,
oh, sorry, I'm still sharing. I'm sorry.
Just for us to be able to. Exactly. You are on the next. Thank you very much, Maria Sole, for this very interesting.
Thank you.
My takeaway is that, as expected, and good to show it and say it again, international cooperation is needed of climate change. And what I take from your presentation is that the involvement of central bank matters to make the solution viable. So it's not only fiscal as the main tool, but central banks can help smooth the decision there by also bringing their contribution. That being said, thank you very much again, and let me just announce to you the next webinar. Next webinar is on November 8th and it's Francesco Giudi, a principal advisor at the European Central Bank, which will present climate change and monetary policy in the euro area. And there, he will in particularly also speak about the ECB action plan to incorporate climate change that the ECB presented at the beginning of this summer, and see what are the new developments there at the ECB, and presented in more detail what they aim to do, or what are the key questions that they are facing. And last reminder, you know that this forum is also has also a Slack channel that you can join to exchange ideas, or also get informed about conferences and articles that are presented. I think I've said everything I needed to. Maria Sole, thanks again, and
thanks to you.
For the viewers, we're gonna see each other in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye.